Good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. I want to thank you for joining us at our special presentation, Who Remembers John Major and Why Should Anybody Care? Tonight, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Victor Bailey, the Batty Distinguished Professor of Modern British History at the University of Kansas, as well as the Director of KU's Hall Center for the Humanities. These titles aside, Victor is also a dear and longtime friend, colleague, and mentor. Over the years that I've known him, I've come to think of Victor, really, as the embodiment of the philosopher king, which is to say, an erudite and learned scholar who was also a superb executive. Indeed, during his 13-year tenure at the helm of the Hall Center, it has become one of the crown jewels of the University of Kansas and is recognized as one of the leading humanities centers in the United States. It is a place where the breadth and worth of liberal arts is demonstrated on a nearly daily basis. There are talks, lectures, seminars, workshops. It is a place that, even in the current strained economic environment, provides an increasing level of financial support for research in various humanities fields. And perhaps most importantly for me, it is a place this year where I spend as many hours as I can as part of my part-time appointment as the Simons Fellow in Public Humanities. It was at one of these times at the Hall Center a few months ago that I first experienced a version of Victor's riff on Margaret Thatcher. I knew immediately that this talk needed to be heard beyond the boundaries of Mount Oread, and I asked Victor if he would consider coming to the library to do just that. He graciously agreed, and the result, tonight, in Victor's trademark combination of wit and eloquence, he will seek to answer several questions about the longest-serving British Prime Minister of the 20th century. These questions are, what exactly was Thatcherism, the only ism attached to the name of any British Prime Minister? Was it good or bad for Britain? And finally, the key point of tonight's lecture, how should we rank Margaret Thatcher as a leader? One brief aside, during the Hall Center version of this talk, Victor cautioned the audience that at times they might hear a woman shouting, "Rubbish, rubbish," after one or more of his assertions about Mrs. Thatcher. The person shouting rubbish would have been his mum. Until yesterday, I thought we might have had a similar situation here. The only difference being that the person shouting rubbish would have been Library Director Crosby Kemper III. My dear friend and esteemed colleague Crosby Kemper, as you may know, has only about 4 photographs in his office. One of them is one of him and Mrs. Thatcher. Unfortunately, Crosby could not be here tonight. He was called to St. Louis for a meeting of the regional chapter of the vast right-wing conspiracy. In Crosby's absence, Victor has agreed that following tonight's presentation, he'll be up for a robust version of that parliamentary tradition known as question time. A native of Yorkshire, Victor Bailey holds 4 degrees, a BA from Warwick, 2 MAs, 1 from Oxford, 1 from Cambridge, and a PhD from Warwick. He's been at KU since 1988. His expertise in British political history notwithstanding, his primary research interests are in crime, law, and punishment in Victorian Britain, as well as the social history of London. He has written a landmark book on suicide in the Victorian era titled This Rash Act, and is currently working on a study titled Policing Victorian London. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend, Victor Bailey.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Henry, for your Very kind introduction. Philosopher King, I am not. Thank you for the invitation as well to deliver this talk in this very beautiful library space. And thank you all for coming out on what is obviously a rather chilly night. I'm more accustomed to audiences of 5 people and a dog, so this is rather intimidating to see quite so many faces. So, as Henry says, let's get on with my riff. Margaret Thatcher was always more uncritically admired in America than in Britain. This was true also of Winston Churchill. For most of the 1980s, I was still living in England, and in the late 80s, I became what I've often thought of as an émigré from Thatcherism, along with not a few English academics, as the English university sector went into deep retrenchment. This doubtless affects my evaluation of Margaret Thatcher, which is not uncritical, though I hope not unfair. Margaret Hilda Thatcher died on April the 8th this year. As the recently published authorized biography by Charles Moore, former editor of the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, rightly states, she's someone about whom it's almost impossible to be neutral. Many think she saved Britain, many that she destroyed it. Thatcher was granted a quasi or almost state funeral, an honour accorded to no prime minister since Churchill. The disagreements over her funeral arrangements vividly demonstrated that Thatcher divided and polarized opinion as much in death as she had in life. The Daily Mail, a conservative-leaning tabloid newspaper, much liked by women readers, claimed her as the woman who saved Britain. The Morning Star, on the extreme left, the paper of the Communist Party of Great Britain, as the woman who tore Britain apart. The Daily Mirror, a left-leaning paper, spoke of the £10 million goodbye and asked, why is Britain's most divisive Prime Minister getting a ceremonial funeral fit for a queen? The April 17th funeral was indeed a lavish affair. The casket on a gun carriage, chaperoned by the armed forces, including the Chelsea pensioners, the ones lined up, I think I can point here, these people here, who are former members of the British Army. The casket went through the streets of London on its way to St. Paul's Cathedral, where the Queen and Prince Philip, Prime Minister David Cameron, and former Prime Minister John Major were waiting. Outside the cathedral, the Queen greeted Mrs. Thatcher's twin children, Mark and Carol Thatcher. In the streets of London and elsewhere, opinion was mixed. But we loved her on one hand. Rust in peace on the other. And filmmaker, left-wing filmmaker Ken Loach pointed the political moral. Let's privatize her funeral, put it out to competitive tender, and accept the cheapest bid. It's what she would have wanted. We could see this level of disagreement over her funeral, however, as a fitting legacy for someone who loathed the concept of consensus and who seemed to relish making enemies more than making friends. Consensus, she once said, was the process of abandoning all beliefs, principles, values, and policies in search of something in which no one believes, but to which no one objects. Her dislike of consensus we shall have cause to return to. In any assessment of Margaret Thatcher's achievements and legacy, one starting point are the firsts she set, most to her considerable liking, one not at all to her liking. She was the first woman in Europe or North America to lead a major political party. She was the first and only woman to hold the position of Prime Minister of Britain and the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. She was the first Prime Minister with a science degree, having read chemistry at Oxford between 1943 and 1947. As an aside, the top leadership in Britain, political and administrative, was and remains scientifically illiterate. She was the first female war leader in the British Isles since Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century, and the first ever in a democratic age. She was the first and only Prime Minister of the 20th century to become an ism. There is no Chamberlain-ism. There is no Churchill-ism. There is Thatcherism, though there is no strong consensus about its definition. She was also, alas for her, the first Prime Minister to be forced to resign, not because the electorate had voted in a general election, nor because a vote of no confidence had been passed in the House of Commons, the two usual ways of defenestrating a Prime Minister, but because of doing badly in a vote of her own Conservative members of Parliament in a leadership contest. She succumbed to one of the most spectacular falls from office since Lucifer. I should have had her as scientist there. She became Prime Minister in May of 1979. Here she is outside 10 Downing Street, citing the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, although a prayer invented in the 19th century, but we'll overlook that fact. A prayer which talks about bringing harmony out of discord, faith out of doubt, hope out of despair, truth out of error. She has a note card in her hand which has those words on it, in case she forgot them. 11 years later, November of 1990, she left Downing Street in tears. She was ruthlessly evicted because it was feared by her Conservative colleagues that she had become a liability with the voters. This was evident above all in the violent protest in central London in March of 1990 over her introduction of the poll tax, a flat rate local tax on each person, not one linked to property value as had been the case. The Duke of Westminster would now pay the same amount of local tax as his chauffeur. So treasonous did she and her supporters deem this ouster that she and they actively undermined her successor, John Major, notoriously over the European Economic Community, to the point that the Conservative Party has failed to gain a parliamentary majority at any general election since 1992. But this is the end, and we need to start at the beginning. Thatcher was first elected to Parliament in 1959. Here she is as the new Member of Parliament and also as junior minister in the Department of Pensions and National Insurance, very low on the totem pole indeed. At this date, and for many years yet, the Conservative Party was dominated by men, by landowners, by products of the public for which read private or fee-paying schools, many of whom had served in the Second World War. These good old boys shared a regimental officer's mess attitude to the party. Their political ideology, if they had one, was that of a vague patriotism. Thatcher came from the other side of the tracks. The daughter of a provincial shopkeeper, the family even living above the shop. This is the one in Grantham in Lincolnshire. A respectable background, based heavily on the Methodist Church, not Mark, Anglican or Church of England, often known as the Conservative Party at prayer, and without the faintest whiff of grandiness. Here is her father in his aldermanic robes, a member of the City Council. Margaret is on the right-hand side, aged 19. Her older sister Muriel is on the left, and her mum in the middle there, who seems to have played little, if any, role in Thatcher's life. It's very difficult to find any comment by Margaret Thatcher on her mother. Her father was clearly the influence, instilling in her his shopkeeper's ethos of hard work, frugality, and patriotism. She elevated from the lower middle class of shopkeeper to solid middle class by way of marriage to a successful businessman 10 years her elder, Dennis, who, one has to say, was a steadfast consort during Thatcher's 30-year political career. Here they are on their wedding day in 1951. Thatcher was very much a hat person at this stage, writing to her sister about every hat she bought or adapted. Even so, if Ladbrokes, the place you can put bets down, if Ladbrokes had offered odds on her becoming leader of the Conservative Party, let alone Prime Minister, they would have given you 2 million to 1 in 1959. Her earliest political speeches inclined mainly to resisting communism and to a romantic belief in the greatness of Britain and its empire and a lament at the nation's decline. Less obvious was an attack on collectivism or socialism as a threat to freedom and economic success. The latter only slowly became more evident in her speeches. For the most part, in these early days, Thatcher followed the Conservative Party line of post-war support for the welfare state, for the maintenance of full employment, and for a mixed economy of private and state-owned industry. Not until 1970 did she attain cabinet rank as Secretary of State for Education, having built a parliamentary reputation for enormous attention to detail. She always knew her brief incredibly well, and for combativity, though not for intellectual originality or for humour. She was so literal-minded, she always had to have jokes explained to her, especially the ones written into her speeches. And she thought double entendres were a silly male game, though she dreaded uttering one by mistake. As Prime Minister in the House of Commons, thanking Willie Whitelaw for his services to the government, she said, "Every Prime Minister needs a Willie." It took quite a long time for her to understand why all the male MPs were stupidly falling about. Education was typically seen as a woman's subject in British politics. It was not a department that enhanced a political career. Indeed, a fiasco soon made Thatcher a household name for the first time, but came close to aborting her political career. The Treasury had decided to abolish the long-standing provision of free milk for health reasons to all primary school children for their morning break. It was thought the decision was Thatcher's. Opposition mounted to what was seen as a mean and squalid policy. The Sun newspaper asked, "Is Mrs. Thatcher human?" But at the Labour Party conference of that year, a speaker coined the damaging phrase that would live with her for a long time: Thatcher, the milk snatcher. What rescued her from this fiasco was the strike turbulence that came to define the government she was part of, and which led remarkably to her elevation to party leader. At the end of 1971, as the milk fiasco grumbled on, Ladbrokes would have given you 20 million to 1 against that outcome. So what went so right for her? The Conservative government of 1970 to 1974, led by Edward or Ted Heath, was committed to a smaller state by cutting government spending, to taming the trade unions, and to an effective incomes policy to control wages and prices in order to bring down inflation. But all of Heath's aspirations crashed into the first national coal miner strike for 50 years in 1972 and again in 1974. I was living in London at the time, suffering the daily power outages and the 3-day working week the country went on to in these years, since electricity was still heavily coal-powered. It was these events, and notably the fact that Edward Heath did a U-turn, a turn away from his aspirations, that led to a fuller critique of conservative policies, the brainchild of Sir Keith Joseph, the most important Jewish conservative of his generation. Thatcher joined Joseph's think tank, which acted to rekindle her interest in the power of ideas. She contributed none herself, but drew from Joseph and others, especially the theory of monetarism, which claimed that inflation was caused not by wage or commodity prices, which incomes policies were supposed to solve, but by excessive increases in the supply of money, which governments had the means to control. Following defeat for the Conservatives in the 1974 general election, Sir Keith Joseph decided to challenge Heath for leadership of the Conservative Party, but almost immediately shot himself in the foot, suggesting in a speech that a high and rising proportion of children were born to young single mums from the lower class who were least fitted to bring children into the world and should be encouraged to breed less, with its undertone, obviously, of sterilization. Joseph was gone. Thatcher took up the standard of revolt. Her husband, Dennis, told her she was mad and would get creamed by Heath in a leadership contest. Every lobby correspondent, every columnist from the press assumed Thatcher would at best shake Heath from his perch, opening the way for the senior male Conservatives to come forward. But the good old party boys liked the spunk of the woman without expecting her to win. On the first ballot, she came out on top. Heath resigned as party leader. Others now joined the contest. Yet on the second ballot, Thatcher won outright. Conservative MPs had decided to reward the one who had had the courage to stand. The outcome reflected more discontent with Heath than positive enthusiasm for Thatcher at this stage. Even so, the grandest, stuffiest political party in the world had chosen a leader whose combination of class, inexperience, and gender would previously have ruled her out. It was not obvious that the party had really meant to do what it had done, or that it was confident of its choice. There were some rocky patches between 1975 and 1979 for Thatcher, especially in the House of Commons, where she rarely impressed in daily battles with the Labour Prime Minister. Yet wisely, Thatcher believed you don't exist as a party unless you have a clear philosophy and a clear message. She was ready for a battle of ideas, even though she was less a woman of ideas and more a woman of beliefs. She took the ideas from others, that political consensus had not worked, that the money supply and public spending had to be diminished, and that lower direct taxes on earnings and investment were needed for economic growth. Her earliest break came, however, via her anti-communism. In a 1976 speech, she accused the Russians of being bent on world dominance. She attacked the illusions of détente. She called for a vigorous defense of the Western concept of rights and liberties. The reaction was more than she could have hoped for. The Red Army's newspaper, Red Star, described her, intending an insulting comparison with Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, as the Iron Lady. This allowed Thatcher to place herself perfectly. As a feminine but strong woman a figure respected by her enemies, a patriotic leader in the tradition of Wellington, known as the Iron Duke after all, and defender of the nation and its values. Overnight, she became a global figure with a sobriquet that marked her out. Of course, in Britain itself, where we take no one too seriously, satire prevailed. This is Peter Fluck and Roger Law's caricature of the Iron Lady with fish slice and a colander on her head. The Iron Lady sobriquet would not have sufficed to win the 1979 election. Again, she was lucky in her opponents. She won the 1979 election by not being Labour, rather than by being the Thatcherite she would become. The Labour government was presiding over an economy that had a very high inflation rate and a very low growth rate, a condition known as stagflation, and also a high unemployment rate. This is a graph of the path of inflation in the 1970s. Can you believe it? In 1975, 1976, Britain had an inflation rate of over 25% per annum. Worse still, in 1978-79, strikes closed down one industry after the next. Trash was piled high in central London because the bin men went on strike. Even the undertakers went on strike in Liverpool. The number of working days lost to strikes went higher even than during the miners' strikes of 1972 and 1974. In 1979, 30 million working days were lost to strikes. The year became known as the Winter of Discontent. In the run-up to the election, or to the election day in May of 1979, most of what Thatcher advocated was not especially novel. What was fresh was her sense of possibility, her zest, and her combativity. And finally, she would do anything for a photo op, including manhandling a calf. She did, however, strike one important note. She pitted what she called enterprise culture against what she called the dependency state. She backed, she said, the workers, not the shirkers. People, she said, should not be better off on welfare than at work. People wanted to hold on to more of what they earned, and they should be allowed to do so. These sentiments went down well with much of the electorate, including, one might say, the working class, long thought of as natural Labour Party supporters. She was creating a new constituency of Conservative voters, many of them from the working class. Her timing was also impeccable. She was on the scene at the moment when almost everyone felt that the nation had run out of road. By the mid-1970s, Britain was coming to be seen as a basket case. Like the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. By 1979, not only was Britain no longer a world power, we were not in the first rank, even as a European power. Labour was blamed during the election. This is a famous Conservative Party poster. Labour isn't working, a reference to the fact that full employment was not being maintained. Though in truth, our economic ills had been a long time coming and were the result of poor productivity, essentially, or output per person employed, in turn caused by poor management of industry, poor labour relations, an archaic structure of trade unionism, underinvestment in new technology, and late entry into the European common market, which would have brought competitive discipline to bear on British industry. In the election of 1979 then, I think people were not so much voting for anything as against something. Against union picket lines barring the way to hospitals, against local authorities that allowed rubbish to pile up in the streets. The election saw the largest swing between one major party and another since 1945. Thatcher's hour had arrived. The Conservative Party would have given her only one chance to succeed. Had she failed in 1979, we would not now, I think, be talking about her to any great degree. Well, let me move slightly from narrative now to a little bit more analysis. Essential to any appreciation of Thatcher and Thatcherism is the political consensus that prevailed in Britain between 1945 and 1979. I long ago invented, for classroom purposes, the concept of Attlee's Triangle. Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister of the first majority Labour government after the war. It was his administration between 1945 and 1951 that built the imaginary structure before you. Like all good triangles, Attlee's was three-sided. First, by 1951, Britain had become a mixed economy made up of private industry, but also nationalised or state industries in coal, aviation, rail, electricity, and gas. Labour had long been committed to nationalising the commanding heights of the economy, and they took the opportunity to do so in the late 1940s. Though I think some would argue that coal, electricity, and gas were not exactly the commanding heights of the economy. Secondly, by state or demand management of the economy along Keynesian lines, full employment was promised. Never again would we return to the 1930s, the dole queue, and depressed industries. Thirdly, a social welfare system was created, offering every individual in the land economic security from cradle to grave, the apex of which was the National Health Service or free medical care. This is the social democratic paradigm, you might say, built by Labour and, this is an important point, endorsed by the Conservatives, that reigned supreme for the next 30 years. Both main parties, Labour and Conservative, agreed to operate within the confines of this three-sided triangle. They were in the middle. These were the props, in a sense, of their policies from this point forward. They agreed to operate within the confines of this structure and not crash through any of the three sides. The point for present purposes is that Thatcher was ultimately willing to punch through some of the sides of this triangle in the cause of stemming economic decline, though it would take a second term of office for her to achieve it. Thatcher formed her first cabinet of government ministers, male to a man. Not one woman in her first cabinet. And in fact, only one woman ever got into a Thatcher cabinet in all the years she was in office. Here she is in the Cabinet Office in Downing Street. Peter Carrington, her Foreign Secretary, is to her right, and opposite is a fairly familiar figure, President Reagan. Far from arriving in Downing Street in 1979 with a bold vision to overhaul British economic decline, however, Thatcher had little more than a hectoring manner. Here she is, hectoring. Plus, an ill-defined belief in monetarism. The most missionary of all modern prime ministers never truly sat down to define her mission or to plan its implementation. In the task of rebuilding the economy, she rather grabbed whatever tools lay to hand. In fact, it was Geoffrey Howe, her Chancellor of the Exchequer at the Treasury, who saw more clearly than Thatcher that a new government had to send the right signals. Howe was the real Thatcherite in these first few years. He it was who argued that the government should contain inflation by setting and keeping to targets for the growth of the money supply, and because government was the guilty party in expanding money supply, government had to set and keep to targets for government spending. The aim would become to cut £8 billion from government spending, or 10% of the total. By 1981, 7 billion had been achieved. Cuts fell on road building, house building, social services, higher education, which is why I'm an emigre, and nationalised industry investment. This in turn caused a sharp contraction of the economy. Sorry for this horrible graph, but this is the annual United Kingdom growth of the economy. The Thatcher premiership is highlighted, but you can't really see the highlighting. It's roughly here. This is 1979. As you can see, steep economic descent took place in the first years of Thatcher's premiership, taking until 1982-83 to return to the growth rate she had inherited in 1979. And there was also a steep rise in unemployment. Unemployment in Britain rose to over 10% of the workforce by the mid-1980s. By 1981 then, with the economy in deep recession, with an inflation rate still of over 20%, a letter signed by no fewer than 364 economists was sent to the Times of London denouncing Thatcher's policies, which were said to be deflating demand, eroding the industrial base, and threatening the country's social stability. As if on cue, riots broke out in inner-city London, in Brixton, and in Toxteth, Liverpool, in April of 1981. Between 1979 and 1982, then, we experienced economic deflation with a vengeance. Manufacturing output fell, unemployment rose. The first phase of Thatcherism was very punishing. The difference was that, unlike Heath, Thatcher did not buckle, did not do a U-turn, despite pressure to do so from her all-male cabinet, who were insisting she reflate the economy. Even so, this was her lowest moment, without question. The Times suggested that the Iron Lady was showing signs of metal fatigue. Once again, she was lucky in her opponents. In May of 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. Britain sent a naval task force of 127 ships to save 2,000 people and 70,000 sheep. In an insignificant outpost of a lost empire. Thatcher gambled everything on recovering the Falklands. She scored a spectacular triumph, but it was a close-run thing. If she had lost, it would have been another Suez moment for her and the country. She resisted American attempts to find a resolution that would have undermined British sovereignty of the Falklands. She kept President Reagan on side, though only just. She turned for expertise and moral support to the naval and military commanders and trusted them to do their job. Here, the Royal Marine Commandos are yomping, as the Marines termed it, across the Falklands en route to Port Stanley and the opposing army. An Argentinian soldier here captured by a member of 2 Para. The conquering heroes returning to Southampton, I think in HMS Invincible. Thatcher congratulating the troops, always in her element when it was raining men. Success led her to believe that she had restored an inherent British greatness that had been lost because of imperial decline. It was this war upon which Thatcher's political survival turned. By the end of 1981, her approval rating had fallen to 23%, the lowest ever recorded. By June of 1982, her approval rating was at an all-time high of 59%. She became the most acclaimed war leader since Churchill. The war now gave her room to execute her economic strategy, to defy her opponents inside or outside the Conservative Party and government, and it gave her a second general election victory in 1983. No transformation in modern British history has been swifter or more complete. She was now in complete command. It also gave her the dangerous idea that she acted best when she acted alone. Her second parliament from 1983 to 1987, and here are images of her looking rather more distinguished by now. This second term was characterized by 3 political dramas. 1, privatization of industry. 2, another miners' strike, and 3, the row over the budget of the European Economic Community. Number 1, in 1979, the electricity, gas, water, coal and steel industries, plus British Telecom, British Petroleum and British Airways were all state-owned and run. Conservatives had often wanted privatization of these state industries, but they'd lost hope they could ever reverse Labour's nationalizations. Thatcher stumbled across the way to do it, sell them off to company employees and to small investors. Here is the privatization of the Trustee Savings Bank with an avalanche of applications coming in from the public. This is how British Aerospace, British Telecom, British Gas and British Airways were privatized. It meant a major rolling back of the frontiers of the state to the tune of £20 billion worth of assets, and it transferred over 500,000 workers from the public to the private sector. And it created a body of people, small shareholders, with an economic stake in continuing Conservative rule. Thatcher had crashed through one side of Attlee's Triangle, the mixed economy. Secondly, by 1984, the government was prepared for what was to be the last stand of the old trade union movement. This was the year-long showdown in 1984-5 with the coal miners that culminated in mass closures of pits and ultimately privatization of the coal industry. This was the defining moment of Thatcherism, if there ever was one. Again, she was fortunate in her enemies. Arthur Scargill, president of the National Union of Mine Workers, here he is, going into the National Coal Board headquarters in London. Scargill picked a fight with the Coal Board and the government over the closure of uneconomic pits. His insistence that only his union should decide when pits could be closed and that every pit should be kept open if it had the smallest amount of coal left in it was a difficult cause to sustain, made worse by the fact that the miners' strike was called without a ballot of members, which undermined its moral as well as legal validity. And the strike was called in spring, when coal stocks were at their highest. The police finally were marshalled as never before to contain, some would say break, the strike. It was a running battle between police and miners for a very long year, the like of which we had not seen in Britain for many years. The strike collapsed after a year. It changed the structure of British politics. An irreversible shift in the industrial balance of power had taken place. In 1979, 73% of voters considered trade union power to be the chief issue facing the country. By 1987, only 1% of voters said the same. The days lost to strikes in 1979 was 30 million. In 1990, it was 2 million. There were 12 million trade unionists in 1979. Today, there are 6 million. Victory allowed Thatcher to ignore the rising rate of unemployment and to pass a series of employment laws that ended many traditional trade union practices. Thatcher had crashed through the second side of Attlee's Triangle, full employment. But what about the third side of Attlee's Triangle, I hear you cry? On this issue, Thatcher's convictions were the conventional welfare state pieties of consensus conservatism. Neither at the start of her career nor when Prime Minister did she ever reject the wartime foundations of the welfare state, whether in health, social policy or education, though she did seek greater efficiencies in the administration of these services. She was never opposed to the principle of healthcare free at the point of use to all patients, which the National Health Service enshrines. Under Thatcher, government spending on health actually increased. Thirdly, Thatcher wanted a fight with the European Economic Community. She wanted our money back. She thought too much went to the common agricultural policy, little of it benefiting Britain, and she won the battle. She got her rebate. This was followed, however, by an increasing hostility by Thatcher to the idea of a European superstate. In fact, it was Thatcher's relentless negativism on the European Union, quite at odds with her views in the 1970s, that pushed her own party and certainly her cabinet to drive her from office. At the same time as these three political dramas, Thatcher urged America to deploy cruise missiles in Britain and Western Europe to restore the military balance with the Soviet Union. She had an ally, of course, in this gentleman here, Ronald Reagan, who shared her worldview and who referred to Thatcher privately as the only European leader I know with balls. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union in 1991, Thatcher took some part of the credit. Throughout these years, she achieved unprecedented success at the ballot box, winning a third general election in 1987, though she was the beneficiary of a Labour Party opposition deeply divided between its right and left wings. The Labour Party was more extreme in its policies than at any stage in its modern existence, making it unelectable before Tony Blair took the lessons of the Thatcher years to heart. Yet we should not exaggerate her electoral success. For a self-proclaimed populist politician, she was never all that popular with the British people. She never played well in Scotland, Wales, or the inner cities. She left the Conservative Party decimated in Scotland, the north of England, and in most urban centres. Her election victories were based on the South, the Midlands, and rural constituencies. Under Thatcher, the Conservatives shrank from a national force to being a party of the affluent South. Well, let me move toward an extended conclusion. The events and policies of these years have resulted in two very different views of Margaret Thatcher. They go something like this. To her admirers, Thatcher was a conviction politician who transformed Britain's economy and politics following the dysfunctional 1970s by rejecting the post-war political consensus. She rolled back the frontiers of the state by returning many state-owned industries to the private sector, cut taxes for high earners, granted to tenants of public housing the right to buy their homes at below market cost, removed trade unionism from its place at the heart of government, possibly the greatest change in the structure of politics since 1940. She proved that mass unemployment did not spell political disaster. She defended Britain's interests in international affairs, strengthened the special relationship with the United States, and helped to precipitate the collapse of communism and the Soviet Union, and finally stimulated a sense of national purpose and will in Britain. As a footnote, her scientific understanding was also influential in one regard. One of the main reasons why climate change debate has never been as partisan an issue in the United Kingdom was Thatcher's early embrace of the science in the late 1980s, which convinced her of the case for action. To her critics, she did not decisively improve the rate of economic growth, and if she did, it was a clawback from the depths of 1981, and it was greatly helped by the tax proceeds from North Sea oil, a short-lived oil bubble that had peaked by 1985. She allowed the manufacturing base to decline, the unemployment rate to rise. There are towns in the north of England, Scotland, and Wales still trying to cope with the recession of the early 1980s. This is not the greatest graph, it just shows the decline in the number of people employed in manufacturing industry, which went from 7 million in 1979 to 4.5 million in 1992, or a 36% decline. In short, in just 13 years of the Thatcher premierships, 2.6 million people lost their jobs in manufacturing industry. Furthermore, she promoted the interests of the rich against the poor and reversed decades of progress towards a fairer society. This is simply a graph of household disposable income, really what you bring in every week. This is the Thatcher period. The point is that for the poor, it totally flatlined for her entire period of office, whereas for the top 10%, so-called rich, it went up by about 50%. She also presided over a frightening rise in the crime rate, from 2.5 million recorded crimes in 1979 to 4.5 million in 1990. She made us more individual, but less cooperative. She did not hold the nation together, she drove it apart. If she revived capitalism, it was by an over-financialization of the economy, which deregulation of the financial markets in 1986 allowed. We went from having a mixed economy with a strong manufacturing base to being heavily dependent on financial services. The financial sector became such an overbearingly important part of the British economy that the crisis of 2008 hit Britain especially hard. Well, where do I stand on all this? I will venture the following 8 thoughts. Some to do with her political impact and some to do with her personality. Britain in 1990 was profoundly different from the country Thatcher took over in 1979. By 1990, the post-war political consensus was in tatters. Attlee's Triangle lay at Thatcher's feet, with the exception of the welfare state. She was ready to abandon every main economic policy that Britain had followed since the war. She established a new political and economic order. 1979 will always be seen as setting British politics in a new pattern. She made the weather in the 1980s. Secondly, Thatcherism, defined as free market economics, individual property ownership, restraints on organized labor, and lower taxation, continues to provide much of the intellectual framework and public discourse within which British politics is conducted today. The key policies of Thatcher's premiership, some of which were bitterly opposed at the time, are now accepted as part of the political landscape. Trade unions within the rule of law, no government bailouts for ailing industries, continued privatization. The Royal Mail, in public ownership for 378 years, presently faces the threat of privatization. Thirdly, Thatcher dismantled and partially destroyed every citadel of Labour votes, Labour patronage, and Labour power. The nationalised industries, the trade unions, council houses, local government. Thatcher's aim was not alone, however, death to the Labour Party. It was an attack on a generation of collectivist thinking. Thatcher preached the Victorian and individualist values of self-help, thrift, family, and authority. She was her father's daughter. Fourthly, Thatcher cleverly faced both ways, however, toward the past and toward the future. Her use of what has become known as Victorian values, an emphasis upon family, hard work, private initiative, allowed her to reassure people that she believed in the traditional ways, while at the same time allowing her to innovate. She could appear simultaneously as a fierce iconoclast and a dedicated restorationist, an avatar of the future and a voice from the past. Fifthly, she was the champion of the middle class. The privatization of state-owned industries in which shares were sold to individual citizens who had never owned shares before was part of this, as was granting to tenants of public housing the right to buy their homes. It was a crusade to spread popular capitalism. It was derided by the labour movement at one end of the class spectrum and by the landowning conservative aristocracy at the other end. She presented herself as a prudent housewife, applying the same principles of middle-class common sense to the national economy as she would to her own domestic budget. The handbag she carried everywhere with her was a sign of female thrift and household management. Sixthly, she blew away all opposition to her policies in determined and at times vindictive ways. The BBC, the Church of England, the universities, the Oxford faculty famously and foolishly declining to give her an honorary degree, the civil service, the doctors, all were hammered by Thatcher for having the temerity to oppose her. Seventhly, she had a drive that was lacking in the languid, complacent, conservative men she overtook. She had a relentlessness that made her both formidable and unbearable. However, she was more the pragmatic, or more the pragmatist, than the Iron Lady of unswerving ideology suggests. She was a highly flexible politician if the situation demanded it. Her stamina became the stuff of legend, needing to sleep no more than 3 or 4 hours a night. It saved her life. When in 1984 the Irish Republican Army struck the Brighton hotel she was in at 2:54 a.m., she was not in bed, as the IRA expected, but in the next room working on her speech for the next morning's Conservative Party conference. Her work rate was prodigious, powered by whiskey. Finally, her ferocious determination, too often shaded into outright aggression, directed at those around her. She criticized and belittled colleagues in front of each other and in front of their staff. They rarely felt able to answer back without seeming disrespectful, and she abused that fact. She also employed the tactic of distancing herself from her own government's measures, giving the impression that she would have done something more radical. She ran with the hare while hunting with the hounds. It was clever politics, perhaps, but two-faced and disloyal to colleagues who never felt they could trust her support. Her comeuppance came in 1990 when her cabinet, almost to a man, declined to support her bid to remain leader of the party. Clearly, whether Margaret Thatcher was good or bad for Britain is still very much a matter of opinion. Any verdict is writ in water and will change countless times before she's entirely forgotten. If I were pressed to offer an epitaph, it would be, "She will go down in history as a dose of medicine, required but not liked, leaving over half the patients wondering whether the cure was worse than the disease." Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. We do have question time for about 5 minutes. Victor will call on you, and he'll repeat your question so everyone else can hear it. Want me to do that?
You call him.
Okay, fine. I'll do it. Question time for Prime Minister Bailey.
You said that Margaret Thatcher was elected as the head of her party because they weren't happy with the current leader. Do you think she was a product of circumstance versus who she was as a political figure?
So the question is, Margaret Thatcher was a victim, was a creature of circumstance or a creature of who she was?
Yeah, I think I'd probably say that around 1974-5, when the leadership contest was going on, I think really the circumstances were the right ones for her. There was such dissatisfaction felt towards Ted Heath that a change just had to be made. The male Conservative figures who you would have expected to come out in opposition were very timid to begin with, didn't really want to oppose Heath in case they lost, etc. So Thatcher really did have the backbone, at least to stand. But I don't really believe that when she stood, many of the Conservative MPs who were voting for her knew a whole lot about her, politically speaking. I don't think they knew exactly where she stood. And they certainly would never have known that she was going to be the Thatcherite that she became, because she really hadn't talked greatly at that point about any of the major policies, privatizing the state industries being just one of them. Really, she was a bit of an unknown quantity, to be honest, and maybe that's why, in a sense, she was ultimately elected. All the other male politicians maybe had supporters, but they also had enemies as well. In some ways, I think Thatcher glided through on this neutral, unknown character in some way. But I think it was the circumstance that just came right for her at that time. But she had the backbone to stand.
Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the idea that the worst result of Margaret Thatcher was Tony Blair?
Okay, so the question is, was the worst result of Margaret Thatcher Tony Blair?
Well, I think, as you're probably aware, Margaret Thatcher herself often sees Tony Blair as her true successor. She does not, or never saw John Major or any of the other Conservative leaders in that role. And of course, as we know, Tony Blair did, in fact, take a good deal of unofficial advice, in a sense, from the way that Thatcher had performed. The fact that he very quickly, before he got elected as Prime Minister, got rid of Clause 4, which is the famous clause in the Labour Party constitution, which talks about taking over the commanding heights of the economy, talking about nationalisation. Tony Blair swept that away with a good deal of opposition from the trade union movement, but he managed to get it through. And of course, that was, I think, crucial to Blair being able to say, I too will not be soft on the trade union movement, which most Labour Prime Ministers over the decades had certainly been. So Blair, I think, was nailing his colours to the mast, in a sense, by saying, some of what Thatcher has done, I will not be reversing course upon. And certainly he never reversed course on all the employment laws that were laid down to keep the trade unions under control. Also, I think Blair was not your typical socialist. He was not wanting to run a state-run economy. He was very impressed with the idea of private enterprise and an enterprise culture, and courted businessmen prior to the election result he got. Whether he's the worst consequence, well, I think that's another lecture maybe on Tony Blair, which I have done, but not tonight.
Yes, sir.
Yes, could you comment on Margaret Thatcher's opposition to the European Union as compared to the present European Union policies today?
Okay, so the question is, compare Margaret Thatcher's opposition to the European Union at the time as opposed to the present European Union of today, European community of today.
Well, Thatcher's approach by the late 1980s to the European community, which is very different, as I said, than what it had been in the 1970s when she was very pro-Europe. That really became ultimately the policy that, or at least the opposition to Europe, would become the reason why the Conservative Party tore itself apart for the next 15 to 20 years. And in fact, it's still there doing it in some ways. John Major, I believe, has committed to a referendum on whether we should stay in Europe or come out of Europe. To me, that's an absolutely mad referendum to be holding. Britain belongs in Europe. Practically, two-thirds of its trade is with Europe. Why would it want to come out and go into splendid isolation again? But Thatcher's the way that Thatcher did this over Europe just, I think, brought tears of desperation to her main ministers, notably Geoffrey Howe and also Lawson, her Foreign Secretary at the time and Chancellor of the Exchequer. They were very pro-Europe, and they found that they were constantly undermined by Thatcher in the way that she was speaking about Europe and the way she was dealing with European partners. And in fact, that's another reason, I think, why ultimately they decided to let her go as leader of the party, because they felt that she had so undermined Europe. I don't know whether I'm entirely answering the second part of your your question about today and so on. Do you want to follow up at all on that and press me a little more? Okay. Okay.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
In either 1984 or 1985, Thatcher encouraged Reagan to previously he had backed away from. To what extent did her encouragement help for Reagan?
So the question, if I can summarize, is what effect did Mrs. Thatcher have on encouraging President Reagan to engage with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union?
I think my honest answer would be I don't really know whether it had a major impact upon Reagan, whether it tipped the balance. I've really no idea. I think it's interesting, however, that Thatcher was really quite the cold warrior for most of her career, and yet in that period decided that she wanted to see if she could make contact with younger members of the Soviet Union hierarchy. She had someone else in mind to begin with, but that fell through, and then Gorbachev got in touch with her, and there was the famous meeting and her famous comment that this is a man I can do business with. The fact I think that Thatcher was willing to do that, however, probably did influence Reagan's own approach to it, but I don't know for sure.
Well, thank you, Victor. Thanks for coming, and we might take you up on that Tony Blair lecture. We'll see you next time.